Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing about the visual reflexes. Visual reflexes, I will be discussing this topic under three main subtopics: accommodation reflex, visual pathway, and pupillary light reflexes. Each of them will be a separate video. So please do follow regularly. So today in this session we will be discussing about the visual pathway. So let's start the visual pathway. So before going in detail, you should have to know some basic idea regarding the visual fields and the visual fibers. So let us say this is our visual field. So this is our left visual field and this is our right visual field. You may confuse because you actually think that this is right and this is left, but actually when we are writing about the fields, this is not the case. You have to apply to your eyes. The left of your eyes will be your left field and the right of your eyes will be the right field. So let's begin this. So if we take this visual field, it will be having two parts, nasal field and the temporal field. So the part of the eye which is closer to the nose will be the nasal and away will be the temporal. So similarly this will be the nasal and this will be the temporal, and the fibers originating from the nasal field will be the nasal fibers and the fibers originating from the temporal field will be the temporal fibers. And one more thing you will have to remember is the impulses from the nasal visual field will be carried by the temporal fibers. Okay, so the nasal visual field impulses are carried by the temporal fibers. So similarly, the temporal visual field impulses will be carried by the nasal fibers. But one thing you should not confuse is the temporal fibers will originate from the temporal side only and the nasal fibers will originate from the nasal side only. But they carry the impulses from the opposite fields. And one more interesting thing is that if I say that the temporal fibers of the left eye are damaged, say I have said that the temporal fibers of the left eye are damaged, that means there is a visual field loss in which part of the eye? Yes, you're right. Obviously, the nasal field will be lost. So, similarly, if I say there is a damage in the the temporal fibers of the right eye, then the nasal visual field will be lost. Are you getting the point? Remember this because this will be very useful in learning the visual pathway lesions, okay? So, with this basic idea, now let's start the actual visual pathway, okay? So this is your left eye and this is your right eye. So as we discussed earlier, let us write about the fields also. This will be the nasal and this will be the temporal fields. And see, these blue color ones are the nasal fibers of left eye, not the whole thing. I will mark it clearly with an yellow one. See, these are the nasal fibers of the left eye and these are the nasal fibers of the right eye. Okay, and these are the temporal fibers. These are the temporal fibers of the left eye and these are the temporal fibers of the right eye. Okay, so the nasal fibers and the temporal fibers together of each eye form the optic nerve. Okay, so this is the right optic nerve and this one will be the left optic nerve. I will rub it for some clarity. So the nasal fibers and temporal fibers together will form the optic nerve. So this is the right optic nerve and this is the left optic nerve. Okay, so you got clarity up to here. Nasal fibers and temporal fibers together are forming the optic nerve, and here comes the main thing. So now the nasal fibers of each side, see, these are the nasal fibers of the left side and these are the nasal fibers of the right side. Now the nasal fibers only, remember this thing, only the nasal fibers. Okay, now the nasal fibers of the both eyes cross each other, cross onto the opposite side. Okay, The point where the nasal fibers of both the eyes cross is called as optic chiasm. See, or optic chiasma, anything. Next, now this structure beyond the optic chiasm is called as optic tract. Now you tell me, what does a right optic tract contain? So if we take a right side optic tract, what does actually the right optic tract will contain? It will contain right side temporal fibers. Okay, because temporal fibers will not cross. Plus it will contain left side nasal fibers. Are you getting the point? Why left-sided nasal fibers have come? Because at optic chiasm, decussation of the fibers have occurred. Okay, decussation of fibers have occurred at the optic chiasm. The right-sided nasal fibers go to the left side, and the left-sided nasal fibers come to the right side. That means the right optic tract contain right temporal fibers along with the left nasal fibers. Now, what does the left optic tract contain? Left optic tract contains left temporal plus right nasal fibers. So this thing should be very clear for you. Okay, so up to now the thing is clear for you. Optic nerve, optic chiasm, and then optic tract. Let me clear the board for you. So after this optic tract is there. No, this optic tract will land in the lateral geniculate body, also called as LGB. Okay, this one you have to remember. They land in the lateral geniculate body, and again from the lateral geniculate body they start to radiate. Okay, remember the term radiate. Here I told you decussate means crossing over. Now from the lateral geniculate body they start to radiate. See, you can see the radiation of the fibers towards what? Visual cortex. They are radiating towards the visual cortex. This is called as the optic radiation. So from the lateral geniculate body they form the optic radiation. So you could clearly see this. And after optic radiation, they end up to be in the visual cortex. So with this, our visual pathway comes to an end. So now let us revise entire things in the visual pathway. So starting with the optic nerve, and at the optic chiasm crossing of the nasal fibers, and then the optic tract which end up in the lateral geniculate body, and from they radiate, which are called as the optic radiations, and then they finally end up in the visual cortex which is located in the occipital lobe. So now we are done with the visual pathway, and now let us discuss about the lesions of the visual pathway. So now let us see what happens when a visual pathway is affected at various levels. So for our class, I will take that the lesions are entirely on the left side. Okay, left side of the visual pathway. Okay, so first, what is the first thing in a visual pathway? Obviously the optic nerve. Say the left sided optic nerve is damaged. So whenever you are writing or discussing about the visual pathway defects, you should make something like this: two circles, and then you have to make a separation, two fields, mention it as a left, right, nasal, temporal. Okay, and then coming to the left optic nerve, what does left optic nerve contain? Left optic nerve contain left side temporal plus left side nasal. That means the complete left eye is damaged. That means both these entire nasal and temporal is damaged. Okay, because the decussation has still not occurred. So now this is called as complete blindness of a single whole eye is called as anopia. Now what do we call this condition as? This condition is called as left anopia. Okay, clear everyone? So next, after optic nerve, what comes next to optic nerve? Left optic chiasm. I'm pretty sure that you know what is the nerves present in the optic chiasm. Yeah, very good. Some of you have already told. Left nasal plus right nasal, because the decussate, it is the decussation point, right? So when left nasal is damaged, that means left temporal field is gone, and when right nasal fibers are damaged, that means right temporal fibers are gone. So what is happening now? That means in both the eyes the temporal field is getting lost. Okay, so here you can see that in each of the eye, only half of the visual field is being affected. Okay, only half of the visual. That means the patient is able to see through remaining half. So half of the blindness is called as hemianopia. And here, since both the temporal fields are affected, are you getting? Since both the temporal fields are affected, this condition is called as bitemporal hemianopia, or this is also called as heteronymous hemianopia. Why this is called as heteronymous hemianopia? See, this side and this side, that means oppositely the visual fields are lost. That is why this is also called as heteronymous hemianopia. Pretty clear? Yeah. After optic chiasma, what do we get after optic chiasma? Left optic tract. So what does left optic tract contain? I discussed this earlier. Left optic tract contains left temporal fibers plus right nasal fibers. Left temporal fibers means left nasal field is damaged, and right nasal fibers means right temporal field is damaged. Now let us see in diagrammatic version. So it will be the left nasal and the right temporal. So did you observe something? Here the visual field loss is in the same direction. So what do we call this? Exactly opposite. Homonymous hemianopia. Okay. Homonymous hemianopia. So clear everyone? So this is not only same for right optic tract. It is very the same thing occurs in lateral geniculate body, I mean lesions at lateral geniculate body. The same visual field loss occurs in case of optic radiation, because the same fibers come down in the left lateral geniculate and the left optic radiation. See, if you see in the left geniculate also, left geniculate body also contains what? It also contains the left temporal and right nasal fibers. Left sided optic radiation also contains the same fibers, hence the visual field defect will be same, that is homonymous hemianopia. Okay. And next, see, and one more thing I have to discuss is, what if the visual field say the visual field is just like this, I mean the visual field loss is just like this. What do we call this as? This is called as quadrantanopia. Okay, so this is called as quadrantanopia. This is just for an illustration. Let me erase. Yeah. And one more thing, even if it is in the visual cortex also, the same thing occurs. What? Homonymous hemianopia. Let me write the visual cortex also. But there is some differences. Let's start that. So before going to discuss the visual cortex lesions, a little bit regarding the blood supply of the visual cortex also you must know. So yeah. So visual cortex is located in which lobe? It is located in the occipital lobe. Okay, and see, this is the visual cortex. This visual cortex, this is the tip of the visual cortex. This tip of the visual cortex is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, whereas the rest of the visual cortex is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Okay, the rest is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Now why are we learning this one? I think from our anatomy video you have remembered the macula, the term macula. Okay, So the tip of the cortex, okay, this is the tip of the cortex. This tip of the cortex is for the macular vision. Okay, what is macular vision? Did anyone remember what is macular vision? Macular vision is nothing but the central vision. Okay, it's the central vision. So it is the place where the cones are at highest concentration. I think you remember this pretty well. It is for the central vision. So if this is the visual field, this is the nasal, and this is the temporal, so this will be the central part of the vision. So this will be responsible for that central vision. Okay, and what about this rest of the visual cortex? This rest of the visual cortex will be the remaining part of the visual field except for the central vision. That means it will be sparing this macular part. So this entire part except that the central portion will be covered by the remaining part of the visual cortex. So if there is any defect in this tip of the cortex, then this macular presentation will be lost. Okay, this central portion of the visual field will be lost. If there is a defect in the remaining part of the visual cortex because of some injuries to the posterior cerebral artery, then only the central vision will be there and the remaining part of the visual field will be lost. Okay, pretty clear, crystal clear. Now let us see the lesions. Yeah, if it is anterior visual cortex, it will be same, the homonymous hemianopia. So if it is the visual cortex lesion, in that the first one, tip of the cortex lesion. So if the tip of the cortex is involved, the same homonymous hemianopia, only this side, okay, are getting only this part of the visual field will be lost. That is homonymous macular defect. We don't call it as homonymous hemianopia because not the entire half of the visual field is involved. See, this full part is not involved, only this part is involved because it's only the tip. Okay, only this part is involved, so that is why we call it as homonymous macular defect. Okay, so coming to the second one, lesion of the visual cortex lesion except the tip. That means what? The tip is not involved, rest of the portion is involved. Same homonymous because same like this only, homonymous will be seen, but this macular portion will not be affected. Are you getting my point? Because the tip is safe, only the rest is involved, the remaining part is all involved. So this is homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. We call this as homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. Okay, pretty clear, homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. I think the concepts are very clear for you. So this is the entire topic we discussed today. So what all you have to know is what is the exact flow chart. So let us write once for our satisfaction. We will write the entire flow chart once again. So starting with the optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. Next, very good, some of you are saying it. Lateral geniculate body, optic radiation, and the visual cortex. And if there is any lesion in the optic nerve, what is that? Anopia. If there is any lesion in the remaining parts, we will be seeing hemianopia. It could be heteronymous hemianopia or homonymous hemianopia. Once just go through the lesions, and regarding the macular sparing and the macular defect also, I hope the concepts are very clear. Thank you for listening to the lecture, and please share it with your friends. Let's meet in the next module.